On the other hand, you might ask what is required to make place identity relevant. And I'm going to leave Appalachia to become fairly theoretical for just a minute, so bear with me. I think my answer to this question now is that one condition which makes place more relevant is the conjunction of otherness with place. That is, a sense of being different, which is associated psychologically with a sense of place. In other words, when one is made to feel different from others by virtue of his or her place of origin or residence, then place identity becomes highly relevant. Place identity is very much like the concept of symbolic ethnicity, which was described by Susan Keefe and her colleagues at Appalachian State not too many years ago. And indeed, the similarities between place identity and certain forms of ethnicity have given rise to what I think is a rather awkward concept that blends the two. It's called ethno-regionalism. I've alluded to earlier to parallel cases among Eskimos, Scots, Indians, and Appalachians, and there are indeed similarities. But as I've also said, in my opinion, there's a major difference which distinguishes the Appalachians and the others, and that's the fact that Appalachian people do not usually possess a high degree of regional identity. I know that statement comes as a surprise and may dismay a few, and it's not one that all Appalachian scholars would necessarily agree with, but I do think it's true that except under special circumstances, regional identity, region-wide place identity is relatively weak among mountain people. If you were to ask a hypothetical sample of 100 Appalachian Kentuckians to answer the question, who am I really don't think many would answer, I'm an Appalachian. And if you gave them concentric place reference, the names of their towns, counties, the region, their states, their nation, and so forth, and then ask them to choose which of those places is most important to them, I believe most would choose other places than the region as a whole, Appalachia. In fact, my guess is more would probably say the South than you would be prone to guess as their region rather than Appalachia. And if in addition one were to ask this hypothetical sample of 100 mountain people where they were from and just leave them free to give any answer they wish, well, in Kentucky especially, you know what answer you'd get. What would it be? A county, right. Or in other states, I don't know why this is a Kentucky trait, but in North Carolina, Laurel, don't you think people are more prone to give town names than county?
Near Asheville.
Near Asheville. And the same in Virginia. Or they'll give the nation or what have you, but not many are going to say Appalachia in response to that question. Now, the exceptions would be instructive. It might happen that some would say, oh, I'm just an old hillbilly, in response to who am I. I've had this response in some interviews where I wasn't really seeking that answer. A response that indicates a kind of a gross self-caricature, a stereotype, as a means of good-natured but self-degrading defense. But because such negative stereotypes are so powerful and so resented, except as an in-joke, if it's done by like Hillbilly Days in Pikeville, you know, that's all right. That's different. It's much more typical that people from the region will cover up their regional origins, even sometimes when the valence of regional identity is high for them. But to me, the most interesting exceptions are the Jim Maggards, the ones who feel so strongly about their place that they want separate states because they feel their region is being cheated of full benefits of its major resource. I think these exceptions are interesting, but they're not typical. I think urban Appalachians also constitute an interesting case, and I don't want to go into any detail here, except to say that research seems to indicate that the strength of we feeling among urban Appalachians is stronger than among those who stay at home. And if that's true, it confirms my hypothesis that when you connect that sense of being different, that differentness, with place identity, then place identity becomes much stronger. I remember a statement from the actress in Strangers and Kin, the Appalachia film, which deals with identity, that she never knew she was different until she left home and went to the city. And that's just one instance of thousands of episodes where that has taken place. I don't know of anybody who handles the dilemmas of identity with more clarity, understanding, and humor than Wayne Miller, whose poem, The Briar Losing Touch with His Traditions, summarizes and makes concrete part of what I'm trying to say here. Once he was a chairmaker, people up north discovered him. They said he was an authentic mountain craftsman. People came and made pictures of him working, wrote him up in the newspapers. He got famous, got a lot of orders for his chairs. When he moved up to Cincinnati so he could be closer to his market, besides a lot of his people had moved there, he found out he was a briar. And when his customers found out he was using an electric lathe and power drill just to keep up with all the orders, they said he was losing touch with his traditions. His orders fell off something awful. He figured it had been a bad mistake to let the magazine people take those pictures of him with his power tools, clean-shaven, wearing a flowered sports shirt and drip-dry pants. So he moved back down to East Kentucky. He had himself a brochure printed up with a picture of him using his hand lathe, bearded, barefoot, and faded overalls. Then, when folks would come from the magazines, he'd get rid of them before supper time so he could put on his shoes, his flowered sports shirt, double knit pants, and open a can of beer and watch the 6:30 news on TV out of New York and Washington. He'd have some time to be himself. Well, my theory is that place identity is strong. Appalachian people interact with people who see them as unlike themselves, who use other people as kind of looking glass for the formulation of their sense of self. As, for example, when they move to cities outside the region, or when outsiders come into the mountains to take up residence or to study mountain people. This simple notion of the looking glass self helps explain why Appalachian identity is weak unless Appalachian people encounter others with sharply, if sometimes superficially, distinctive characteristics, and especially with negative, opposing perceptions of mountain people. I think it's also important to proceed to the second related question of how regional identity, to the extent that it does exist, becomes politicized. That is, how it becomes the basis for group action in pursuit of shared interests. Place identity by itself is just a sentiment. Group identity doesn't always lead to group action. That shared feeling that we are a people must be wrapped around some issue which is seen as affecting the interests of the group. A defense against some perceived intrusion or threat or inequity, or an action in pursuit of an opportunity for group advancement. Apparently, it's easier for people in some regions to recognize place-relevant issues and opportunities than in others. And it seems relatively difficult to do so in Appalachia. In this region, the we is often from the same place as the they. The issues, whether they're labor issues or environmental ones or questions of welfare rights or housing, jobs, mineral taxation, educational improvement, or whatever, do not simply involve Appalachian versus non-Appalachian people. The most salient issues in the region usually do not rotate on regional axes. Another deterrent to the regional mobilization of political sentiment and action is the fact that while Appalachia may be a geographic area within the United States, it's not a governmental unit. In fact, it's crisscrossed by numerous such units, states, counties, area development districts, for example. States and counties compete for the political affections of their citizens and for their taxes. They're strong kingdoms and princely domains within a region, and their existence works against a regional conception of social action. You know, I think, the best example of the difficulties that have to be transcended in passing beyond these governmental boundaries in order to act regionally, and that's the Appalachian Regional Commission. You know that federal agency works, but only through and with the consent of the several states involved. The political overhead costs of its achievements, and there are great achievements of the ARC, but the political overhead costs are enormous for this reason. But they're required by the nature of the intersecting governmental boundaries imposed on the region. For these and related reasons, regional identity, even when it does arise, seldom becomes galvanized into action in Appalachia. And that's why Jim Maggard's and our other neighbors' plea for separation are so remarkable. Even in this instance, you notice separate statehood is being asked for by just little parts of Appalachia, not the whole region. I would observe further that many of the instances of social action we could cite in Appalachia, such as movements for educational improvement, or labor struggles, or economic development initiatives, defensive protests against intrusive external interests, progressive tax efforts, and so on. They've been movements in, but not of the region as a whole. The presence of what David Matthews calls political community, the shaping of a people who agree that they share the same interests, has not been achieved in any pan-Appalachian sense. Here I'd like to offer a comment about the connections between Appalachian studies and Appalachian identity. First, I'd point out the probability that Appalachian studies has itself had some effect on Appalachian identity. There's been a conscious effort on the part of many Appalachian scholar activists to promote more intense regional identity and the mobilization of political sentiment. Because Appalachian studies was born in a kind of political fervor at a time when activism was at its peak in the mountains, it's always felt always felt it desirable to do more than just study the region, but to act on behalf of the achievement of social justice, whether in the name of revolutionary practice or Christian service or just doing good. Consequently, this is one academic field of study which has intentionally tried to have an effect on what it was studying. Now, I can't estimate the net effects of these efforts except to say that they certainly have not reduced regional self-consciousness. And I'd go further to say that even the non-activist scholars have had some effect on regional identity through their publications and teaching. Their ideas and their perceptions are readily accessible to mountain people whose own self-conception are bound to be influenced by looking into these scholarly looking glasses. Second, as we proceed with further studies of Central Place in Appalachia, I'd like to issue two caveats. First, and most obviously, the matter is much more complex than many writers have wanted to believe. I think many of the complexities can be unraveled through comparative regional studies. Second, I cannot escape the conclusion that some writers assume rather than demonstrate the existence of strong regional identity in Appalachia. Periodically, and in particular locations within the region, there are concerted movements, including strong resistance movements. They are, as I've said, however, political movements within and not of the region as a whole. And moreover, I fear that writers occasionally assert what they haven't proved, either to make a point because they wish to be optimistic about the future of the region, or whatever. Whether it's optimism or maybe a requirement of certain scholarly doctrines, I really don't know. But I do think I detect a tendency to see things that aren't there. And I would include Pierre Clavel's book on opposition planning in this observation. As I see it, there's so many potent factors working against regional identity and social action movements based on it that it is a marvel it is ever expressed at all. We find, on the other hand, in the region as elsewhere, strong attachment to particular places within Appalachia, such as communities, neighborhoods, creeks, hollows, counties. What is needed, in my opinion, is a new kind of activism which builds upon these existing attachments to smaller places. Given the shifts taking place in the role of national and state governments in the United States in this decade, I think that is where action is going to have to take place for the improvements which are called for. And self-determination from within localities will be much healthier in the long run. What is needed is the sharpening of visions among local citizens about possible futures for our mountain communities. Education in the broadest sense for the local leadership in whose hands the future rightly lies. And the development of a political culture which will support extensive public participation in those local organizations and efforts which will carry those communities into the future. There is a place somewhere, it's right here, within our local communities, not in that abstraction we call Appalachia, with which there may well be stronger identification in the minds of its scholars than its inhabitants. Thank you very much.
The tragedy of the North Carolina writer Thomas Wolfe was that he spent his career burning himself out in New York and in Europe in a very futile attempt to find there a sense of place that he had known in Appalachia, in the area around Asheville, North Carolina. And Wolfe comes really quickly to mind when thinking of religion in Appalachia and of the mountain sense of peace. And we could do worse than to use Wolfe's words as opening scripture to set the mood and to unwind a message for this essay. These are familiar words to many of you. Naked and alone we came into exile. In her dark womb we did not know our mother's face. From the prison of her flesh have we come into the unspeakable and incommunicable prison of this earth. Which of us has known his brother? Which of us has looked into his father's heart? Which of us has not remained forever prison pent? Which of us is not forever a stranger and alone? O waste of loss in the hot mazes, lost among bright stars on this most weary, unbright cinder, lost. Remembering speechlessly we seek the great forgotten language, the lost lane end to heaven, a stone, a leaf, an unfound door. Where? When? O lost and by the wind grieved ghost, come back again. Now at the moment, this immediate moment that you and I are sharing, our sense of place is something like this. We are in front of this audience of scholars in a scholarly symposium on a scholarly campus on the western edge of central Appalachia. And I think under such conditions, the natural and the safe approach, certainly probably the appropriate approach, would be to organize well the wealth of that scholarship on this subject of religion in Appalachia and interject a few clever asides and aim for some succinct synthesis that can pass for freshness. But my own attention span in my aging years is defined by my prostate gland, and I've become very put out, I guess, with annotated descriptions. They get boring. Boring to the audience and boring to me. Selected at least not to bore myself, and I'm not going to give you that sort of synthesis. The literature on Appalachia, on this region and on religion in this region is just really overwhelming. It's so bountiful. And it's so plentiful in facts that one feels that scholars long ago outstripped the mining companies in leaving bare these mountains and finding anything new. Most of the material that you find in scholarly journals about religion in Appalachia is descriptive. It becomes tedious and it becomes repetitive. And I resist the natural temptation to treat this topic of religion in Appalachia as sociology or as history, because objective research, though accurate, pays too high a price for its neutrality. In its rigid nonpartisanship and its objectivity, descriptions of Appalachian religion read like tour guides or bird watchers' manuals. Residents have a hard time recognizing themselves in dispassionate distillations of their spirits, and outsiders fail to get the feel of the region's religiousness. It's very important for you to understand that I speak this morning as an outsider. My career has been at the periphery of Appalachia, and I come to you not as an expert on your region, and not as a resident, but as a periphery observer who just wants to make some observations that make you some food for thought. I lived in Lexington 6 years at one edge of Appalachia. Spartanburg technically is in the Appalachian Regional Council area, and so I'm at that periphery now. Even when I lived in Tuscaloosa, that was, as far as the government concerned, part of Appalachia. And when I lived in Knoxville for 3 years, it was the same story. But it's always been a sense of observing and being at the edge and seeing. Now, for those of you who can't get along without a clear list of the religious facts, one of the best synopses that I can recommend to you is a recording of a talk made at East Kentucky a few months ago by Loyal Jones of Berea. Another good description that you might want to look at is Chapter 9 of Catherine Albanese's book, America, Religions and Religion, entitled Regional Religion, a Case Study of Tradition in Southern Appalachia. Jack Weller's observations in Yesterday's People, especially the emphasis that he places upon personalistic religion, are very widely quoted by everybody. And F. Carlene Bryant's chapter on churches in her case study of a top-of-the-mountain neighborhood called We Are All Kin deserves special notice. And I'll leave other references in the bibliography at the end of this paper. But the basic facts really are not irrelevant. I don't put down facts. Both Jones and Albanese confirm that the base stock of this region is English, Scotch-Irish, and German, mixtures of some others. Over half of the people of the region claim church membership, Albanese reports. Less than 1% claim no religious faith at all, according to Jones. Those figures are not contradictory. They tell us that Appalachia is a religious region in which formal and informal religion are blurred, in which direct access to scriptures and the priesthood of all believers are affirmed, in which consenting adults take religion personally, in which immediate experience outweighs lifetime Christian education and nurture and an educated ministry, in which institutional religion fills the hollows with small churches dominated by all varieties of Baptists, isolated both from the mainstream American churches, which everybody talks about, but also from one another. And I think that's an important point. The isolation of the churches and the hollows and the sections within Appalachia are conspicuous, is conspicuous. This is a region in which individualism and local congregational autonomy predominate, in which both Calvinism and Arminianism, or faith and works, God's grace, man's acts, which in other places have been polarities, somehow merge in this region, and they survive without serious paradox and with particular stress upon holiness, which was a very Methodist type of concept, but which has been absorbed by many of the churches of this region, with a special emphasis upon obedience to the Holy Spirit acting within man directly. This is a region in which some scattered snake handling and fire handling take place, even more foot washing and triple immersion baptizing. It's a region in which the natural laws of the wilderness and from folklore and Indian experience merge with the transplanted and the transmuted theologies and polities of men who remember their migrant ancestors from the late 18th and the 19th centuries, and remember and cherish those people by keeping the faith. You bear witness to your family and to their faith by keeping that faith. In short, taking all those facts, Henry Shapiro, in an excellent book called Appalachia on Our Mind, condenses all of the descriptive scholarship into a telling phrase, one phrase: a strange land inhabited by a peculiar people. That's Appalachia. Now, religion didn't come to Appalachia with churches and ministers, or in the saddlebags of Bishop Asbury, or in the sermons of those two Baptist ministers who accompanied Daniel Boone through the Common Gap. Despite its external trappings of churches and preachers that you see everywhere in Appalachia, despite its ties to the outside world through its heritage of this preservation of the Father's faith, despite the invasion by home missionary societies from mainstream American Protestantism and from the priestly orders of Catholicism, Appalachian religion essentially is indigenous, homegrown, and distinctive more than it is denominational and derivative. What lies between the lines of the descriptive scholarship and in the graveyards behind the white-planked churches is what Appalachian religion really is. And I find three aspects of that reality to be a lot of fun to focus on. I want to make 3 points. One is that in Appalachia, God speaks in tongues through popular mountain vernacular and through sign language, especially. Secondly, in Appalachia, everything is spirit-touched and God-filled. There is an unusual, holistic reconciliation of the material and the immaterial worlds, of the immediate and the not-so-immediate, the invisible realms of being. And third, in Appalachia, if the measure of God's grace and if the definition of the good life elsewhere in America, outside of Appalachia, is economic affluence, as Jimmy Baker would have us believe, or as Max Weber suggested in Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, then if that's the measure of religiosity, economic affluence and well-being, then everything in Appalachia is cursed. Now, the starting point for digging beneath the descriptive surface of Appalachian religion is in a definition of religion itself. Obviously, religion is more than its institutional and its external manifestations. Alfred North Whitehead said that religion is what man is in his solitariness. Paul Tillich said that religion is whatever is ultimate, the ground of being beneath which the pursuit of what is humanly most important can be mined no further. If one sees life as between time, as most Appalachians have, religion is something pre-existent and post-existent to this worldly world, something immaterial in the very best sense of that word. We put different connotations on that word immaterial, but I'm talking here something immaterial being very important, which offers intimations of immortality and of reality, useful, enduring life as pilgrimage and as process. Pilgrimage is one of the great themes of all civilization that needs to be explored. And you can think about that as you look at all of the things that you read, of John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, James Joyce's Ulysses, read the Odyssey, and the 20 years or so that this man spent trying to get back home. Back to his home place, and then the pilgrimage itself becomes important as actually getting to that final destination. My favorite example of the progress theme, of the Odysseus Ulysses type of theme, is the Yellow Brick Road, and Dorothy's placed down in this. She's taken out of a black and white world and put into a technicolor world, and she goes through this process, and finally, after all these trials and tribulations, discovers that she had all along within herself the power to return home anytime she wanted to, just by clicking the red hills and wishing to be there. But the pilgrimage that she made was very important. The whole college process is a pilgrimage. It's a yellow brick road. And I guess that would mean the president of this institution, when you graduate, is the wizard you're going to find behind the curtain who will let you go home. Religion is the process of seeking alignment of the self in its allotted brief lifetime with something ultimately other, capital O, from another time that is timeless. The emphasis is upon the seeking, for whenever the emphasis shifts from seeking to finding, from searching to certainty, then religion disintegrates in controversies and schisms, and it becomes human and sociological all over again. Religion ultimately, therefore, is an aligning process of the empirical with the eternal, the material with the spiritual, the evident and the immediate with the invisible and the everlasting. Now, alignment requires a language. For somehow we have to communicate our religious experiences and our insights, either because we're commanded to tell good news, or because we're afraid people will think it's crazy if we don't explain to them why we feel the way we do about our religion. Inadequacy of religious language is everywhere a dilemma, but it's especially so in Appalachia, where language is more heavily metaphorical, more anthropomorphic, more analogical than anywhere else. There are other regions than Appalachia in America, but very few match it for distinctiveness of image and explanations. It has about it the linguistic self-containment of the Puritans, who pulled into themselves and talked about their city on the hill that they were trying to build in this new world. Before them, there was this self-containment of the pre-Constantine Christians in the catacombs. One can also say that modern California is a region But out there, the cement that holds it together is fatalism of knowing that that entire state will slide into the Pacific Ocean soon, and rushing to build houses at 10 times their value in anticipation of that demise. It's a strange culture, probably stranger than Appalachia. In Appalachia, religion is more Native American, almost Indian, and identification with place is more important than ownership of it. But in either case, identification with place is the key to understanding Appalachian religion. The religious language of Appalachia is more lyrical and alliterative than any other in our country. Appalachian religion couples ambiguities with absolutes. It pairs assimilation with apocalypse. It teams alienation with affinity. It joins apathy with anticipation. It weds agony with acceptance. It unites anecdotes with anecdotes and aphorisms with abstractions. It ties animism and anthropomorphism to allegories and to analogies. And it blesses anxiety by binding it to assurance. The extraordinary nature of Appalachian religion is its pervasive use of the ordinary. In Appalachia, whatever is material is important largely as a language for the immaterial. Robert Penn Warren put, "The world is a parable, and we are its meaning." For Appalachians, flesh and blood, you use that phrase all the time, our flesh and blood. In Appalachia, flesh and blood are ultimates, Tillich's ultimates. Kinship is Appalachia's kingship, its closest analogy, the fatherhood of God and the family of God's people. Kinship. One talks of kin as if one were talking of holy things and holy existence. On any given Friday, drive in any direction out of the mountains and you will meet a sea of cars from Cincinnati, Knoxville, Wheeling, and Lexington, from Ohio and Louisville and Charlotte. These are Appalachia's boat people, exiles returning home every weekend of their lives and then symbolically leaving every Sunday after church. The flesh and blood of Christ are kinfolk and place. Cousins and churches, kitchens, coves are ultimate realities in this world that are the closest one comes to what is yet to come. The most visible and tangible links to the invisible and intangible order and other. The concrete of the highway is the process pathway, the pilgrimage pathway to the immaterial world that matters the most. Life is just a mountain parkway. I'm but a stranger here. Heaven is my home. Mountain road, take me home. In TVA and the Dispossessed, a book by Michael McDonald and John Downey, the authors tell us about 3,000 families, mountain families, around what is now Norris Dam, who gave up their farms and their churches and their enclaves to TVA without much complaint in 1933. But when TVA came to get the 5,000 bodies in their cemeteries, war broke out. What the TVA were but bodies were to the Appalachians a collective soul. The authors say this sense of community was conservative, embracing the dead as well as the living. To the displaced and uprooted living, these graves mute testimony, evidence of the continuity of their own existence and prove the permanency of the past and an irrefrangible link to their collectively shared communal and familial memories. Do another side. Robert Penn Warren writes such beautiful poetry, but one of his poems was about his mother's death. His mother died after the father had already gone. And he wrote this poem to his mother, and the key point of the poem was that when he would go home, The only way he knew his home, his old home place, was through his mother. They would walk in the cemetery and she'd explain who these people had been and what roles they played in their community. And he felt the great loss that his mother's death was causing was that he had no one left who could name the peoples and the places of his own past. And so all that continuity was being broken for him. It's like someone, you take that reference point for granted. You know, I always ask mothers, you can tell me who so-and-so was. But it would be like someone going to your library and burning your card catalog when you had a research paper due the next day. You know, your whole point of reference would be lost. In Appalachia, the categories of this worldliness and otherworldliness seldom hold. Traditionally, the balance, if skewed at all, has favored the other world here in Appalachia, which is why the radio preachers who you hear on this region's airwaves seldom bother with social gospel messages about improving the state of the community or warring on poverty. They very seldom even have sermons on temperance or on the teenage initiation so popular in Appalachia of mixing fast cars and winding roads. Their concern is on the other world, or on personalizing religion in one's own feelings. Roots, both in plant form and in folk form, give religion its importance in Appalachia. God fills everything there. To be away from God is to be away from home in Columbus or Cleveland or Asheville or Nashville. The material gives meaning to the immaterial. Flesh and blood home folks become transubstantiated emblems of a divinity which hangs upon the mountains in its midst, beckoning the homeless home, the God-forsaken to God. When one never knows what tomorrow will bring, Sunday dinner with the family is always the Last Supper. Life itself is sacramental when one lives it in clearings of isolation and poverty on the edge of the cliffs of eternity. Take away the sense of place from Appalachians and you take away their faith. Substitute trust in this world and in its goods for trust in family and in the world of the other, and you strip mine the real soul. Now our gifts from the outside, those of us who are outside of Appalachia, our gifts from the outside world to Appalachians, we give you health and education and affluence, leisurely enjoyment of dolly woods and heritage villages and stamps and longevity. We sincerely offer them, but there's a price, and most Appalachians know the price that is paid for those things, just as when they used to come in mail-order catalogs lugged up the creek beds on U.S. mules. Our asking price for progress is assimilation. That's just another word for the loss of sense of place. Now, Appalachia has continued to resist our offers, but there are signs that we are wearing the mountains down, and our ethic of exploited abundance has been at war with the ethic of Appalachia since Alvin York went to Germany and brought the world's attention to Appalachia. There's been a 100-year war since then, and it is a war that Appalachia is about to lose. In her novel, Oral History, Lee Smith's Jennifer, who's an anthropology graduate student, is transformed by the unexpected mysteries, the religious mysteries that she finds in her family's mountain past. The book ends with a mountainside funeral from which an old woman disappears and is found throwing away a pair of earrings that symbolize the religious mystery of her family and of that place. The dissertation writer says, "It's just about the worst and saddest thing I ever saw. She stood there with her arms flung out like a big black statue in a church or something for the longest time." But then she goes on, but by the time she gets back to college, Jennifer has stopped crying and gotten a hold of herself, and she's changed all around in her mind, in her head, They still live so close to the land, all of them. They're really very primitive people, resembling nothing as much as some sort of early tribe. All that is changing. Wendell Berry notes in his rearguard action against it, at present our society is almost entirely nomadic, without the comfort or discipline of memories, and it is moving about on the face of this continent with a mindless destructiveness of substance and of meaning and of value that makes Sherman's march to the sea look like a prank. The outsiders are moving in, the insiders are moving out. The religious sense of place will be flung away into an abyss of mass communication, transportation, urban dependency, employment by others, and a mobility already so pervasive that Henry Shapiro believes talking about Appalachian distinctiveness is anachronistic. One now has to acknowledge diversity as an Appalachian trait, or else be labeled a romantic for imposing unities that never have and certainly no longer exist. Roger Cunningham makes the same point in one of the most remarkable recent studies of Appalachia, Apples on the Flood, where he describes Appalachian as a peripheral, almost a third world region that stresses identity, and notes that the periphery status of Appalachia is also its death cause, because the dominant culture against which this periphery abuts and has served as both barrier and access cannot resist the temptation to destroy its boundary settlements. And thus they are manipulated, Appalachia is manipulated into carrying out the metropole's genocidal program while being culturally and socially destroyed themselves, according to Cunningham, who does some wonderful analogies with the Scotch ancestry of Appalachians to show what happened in Scotland when it was a periphery society, and he transfers those lessons here. Lee Smith, to go back to oral history, Lee Smith's epilogue, I think, says just as much about what's happening in Appalachia. These mountain people that she was with are all going to change, she knows. She says, eventually Deborah will have a hysterectomy, Roscoe will win a Morehead scholarship to the University of North Carolina, Troy will start a rock group, Sally and Roy will buy a retirement house on Claytor Lake, Susie Q will marry Young, old Richard Burlage will write his memoirs and they will be published to universal if somewhat limited acclaim by LSU Press. Little Luther or May will get sick one by one and die. Donnie Osborne, institutionalized for years, will get older and older, fashioning the dowels he especially loves to make in the prison workshop. Al will be elected president of the Junior Toastmasters Club. Then he will make a killing in Amway and retire from it young, sinking his money in land. He will be a major investor in the ski run, which will be built eventually on the side of Black Rock Mountain. The success of this enterprise will inspire him to embark on his grandest plan yet, Ghostland, the wildly successful theme park and recreation area, campground, motel, Olympic-sized pool, water slide, gift shop in Hoot Owl Holler. Ghostland, designed by a Nashville architect, will be the prettiest theme park east of Opryland itself. Its rides and amusements terraced up and down the steep hollow, its skylight zooming up and down from the burial ground where the cafeteria is, and the old home place still stands smack in the middle of Ghostland, untouched. Well, perhaps it's already gone. Appalachian distinctiveness, a religious sense of place, splintered into modernity and diversity. Still, whatever its shattered, shadowy, and vanishing state, it does exist when you place it beside the monumental myth that we call mainstream modern America. To be God-filled it should not be mistaken for being God-blessed. God filled the Hebrew lives, certainly, chosen race, but he also opened the earth and swallowed them by the hundreds. He took away their lands and he sent them into captivity, and he made his presence known as much by his vengeance as by his mercies and his election. I'm going to use a word that was forbidden in my household when I was growing up and still is in my own household. It's a descriptive word and it has meaning, and I don't mean any disrespect or humor in it. A great deal of Appalachian holistic distinctiveness as a God-filled region is that it is a God-damned region. I've never been able to finish reading Harriet Arno's novel, The Doll Maker. Someone's speaking on it later today, and I hope you hear it. But no writer I've ever read has captured so indelibly a sense of place, with the possible exception of Faulkner writing about his postage stamp county in Mississippi, or maybe Eudora Welty in Losing Battles. The Doll Maker is the most religious book I've ever tried to read, and it is so well written that I run from finishing it. I cannot finish that book out of religious fear of the tragedy with which it inevitably has to end. Gertie Neville's a strong mountain woman who's able to stop midnight traffic on highways from astride a mule, is transplanted to Detroit by the economy and by her husband's dreams of acquiring refrigerators and cars and other gadget symbols of God's blessings. Detroit is Gertie Neville's Babylonian captivity. Gertie's own aspirations had been simply to own a little plot of land in the mountains, her place, where she, Antaeus-like, drew her strength. She was strong only in her place. Antaeus, those of you classical class, I guess you already know who Antaeus is, but he got his strength by being in touch with the ground, and the only way that you could kill him was to pick him up off the ground and get out of contact with the earth. Owning land to Gertie provides food that neither rental property, nor Detroit, nor God, nor the government provide. Food is the bottom line of life on top of the mountain. Ernest Becker, in his remarkable books on death and evil, makes a very convincing case that food is the bottom line cause of all heroism, all evil, all power. The geraniums on the stoop of the tenements in Detroit are a vestige of a universal sense of place, as a source of life, as a source of food, as a relatedness of me to the land and to God. One doesn't grow food in Detroit. One sells oneself to buy food. And so salesmanship is the mainstream American religion that Appalachian has been slow to adopt. Harsh forces, poverty, a child's death, another one's disappearance, isolation, loneliness, all of that comes to Gertie in Detroit. They are crushing. But empirically, they are very little different from the type of life that she had to endure. She actually lived in Appalachia. So what is the difference? In both places, she professes no faith in God's justice or mercy. The difference is that in Appalachia, Gertie accepts life as damnation. In Detroit, she loses that sense of acceptance that having a place gave her, and so she sells herself. In the mountains, before she moved, Gertie had a piece of wood sitting in her one-room cabin. To anyone else, it was just a block of wood. But Gertie always saw in that block of wood the figure of Christ. And it was her intention someday to carve away from that figure of Christ in the wood those pieces of wood that were extraneous to it and that hid Christ. She was always going to do that. And she takes the wood with her to Detroit. And as she loses her Appalachian sense of acceptance, she jettisons the vision of the divine immaterial within the worldly material. And away from the land that grew the wood, that holds the vision, what matters more and more in Detroit is survival and is the material itself for its mercantile value. And so, from Christ wood of Appalachia, Gertie carves and sells grotesque, cheap dolls, whittling away her soul in the process of losing the immaterial. One great and unique message of Appalachia from the mysteries hidden in the mountain mist is this: what matters most is what value we choose to put upon what is immaterial. And the second message is likened to it: the people closest to God in this world are the goddamn people. Those who feel most the heat of the wrath of God have at least the assurance that city-dwelling secularists and name-only religionists lack, that God does in fact exist. His wrath is testimony to his existence, and God does take people personally. That's the Appalachian religion. For the Gertie Nevilles of Appalachia, there are always assurance of food as long as there's a patch of land and a parcel of kin, and there's always assurance of the presence of God as long as daily damnation can be felt. Life is a test and a waiting, and the hell worse than that certainty of damnation, to be driven from the land and from the kin, to live in the uncertainty east of Eden in Detroit. Television evangelists know nothing of this kind of religion. Their eyes sparkle like the diamonds on their fingers and the caps on their teeth when they are proclaiming the rapture of Jesus and the outpouring of God's gracious affluence. But the eyes of Appalachians are flat. They stare a lot. They're silent a lot. They rock on porches a lot. They accept the presence of God in their lives, and they see signs of God all about them. Acceptance and accommodation are their way of life. Their silence is a reproach to forces that try to break them, to God and to absentee landlords and to modernity. They hang their Clorox bottles on limbs, and they put their dead cars on cinder blocks to protest the throwaway world that impinges upon them and the stripping of the land about them that drives them to sell bedspreads by the roadsides. Part of the acceptance at the heart of Appalachian religion, of course, is harmony. Nature in Appalachia is, if anything, rhythmic and predictable, and the native absorbs seasonal cycles and brook babblings and organic organization and harmonizes with them. Part of the acceptance of Appalachian religion is habit, braced with generation of isolation and experience and good Scotch-Irish stubbornness. One survives as one's kin have and one does that with dignity. Part of Appalachian religion is education, Appalachian education, the education shaped by shape note singings and homecomings and graveyard tendings, by knowing scriptures by heart even when one is illiterate, by feeling God-filling lives with consciousness of what it meant to live in a world where both the fall season, the fall of man, still mean something, and by seeing in the invasions of outsiders determined to save them the final damnation approach like the headwaters of a rushing mountain flood. The one thing Appalachians have left that makes them distinctive in their religion is their religious message that life in this world is a trek, a pilgrimage, a trek of tragedy, and that God's will is for us to know tragedy. When at last we have exploited and stripped Appalachians of everything they have of any material value, that will be all they have left that we can take from them. The message, the importance of the immaterial. And with God's grace, perhaps we might even take that from them too, for ourselves. Thank you.
We have time for one or two brief comments. He strode to the front window one day and he gazed across 17th Street and he said, "How would you like to have as much money as you know where the post office is? How would you like to have as much money as you know where the post office is?" We knew what he meant. He was money crazy, I guess. I'm going to apply this to what I've said. From 1917 until 1986, last year, post office was always on 17th Street, and everyone in Ashland knew it. Very few even remembered before 1917 when it was on 16th Street. But last year, the old post office closed and a new one opened on 12th Street. The next generation they'll think post office was always on 12th Street. But don't discount habit. With regularity, I still, right across the street from the old post office, it's been a year later, people still come to that door and they pull on it, and they pull it, and they back away. And they're as amused and amazed as if they were on candid camera because the post office is closed. A 70 habit is very hard to break. We need to recognize that some of our most respected traditions stand on false pedestals.